Donald Trump under fire for taking Putin's side of the story, yes, again. Now, if you watch the news, you know this is a recurring theme in a week that has seen Donald Trump try to walk back his embrace of Putin in Helsinki, then face withering criticism, including from many conservatives. And tonight's problem begins with Donald Trump saying this.
Is Russia still targeting the U.S., Mr. President?
Press, let's go. Make your way out. No, you don't believe that to be the case?
You hear it there, no. And last time it took Trump, well, about a full day to backtrack. Today it was a few hours and the White House tried to take what you just saw back.
Is that what the president actually believes? Do you understand the question? And is his position that no, Russia is not doing anything to interfere or meddle in the 2018 election?
I got a chance to speak with the president after his comments, and the president said thank you very much and was saying no to answering questions.
No to answering questions. So Donald Trump lies and trolls a lot. That is a documented fact. The question for America is how to respond. And his attempts at damage control this week increasingly inviting ridicule, like the normally Trump-friendly TMZ saying that yesterday's dodge amounted to Trump, I didn't commit treason, I just botched a double negative. And today's claim that no wasn't really a no drew mockery from Republicans.
Do you believe it?
No more questions. No, I guess that's what. That's a joke. I saw it. It sure looked like he was saying no. That's consistent with what he's been saying, again and again and again, that he mistrusts our intelligence services and believes the words of Putin.
So that was a joke there, which wasn't funny because the problem is so serious. Now, to be fair, unfunny jokes are something we know a lot about here at The Beat. Meanwhile, tonight, the president compared himself to Putin in a new interview.
You agree with U.S. intelligence that Russia meddled in the election in 2016?
Yeah, and I've said that before, Jeff. I have said that numerous times before, and I would say that that is true, yeah.
But you haven't condemned Putin specifically. Do you hold him personally responsible?
Well, I would, because he's in charge of the country, just like I consider myself to be responsible for things that happen in this country. So certainly, as the leader of a country, you would have to hold him responsible, yes.
What'd you say to him?
Very strong on the fact that we can't have meddling, we can't have any of that.
Very strong to Putin that we can't have meddling. That is allegedly how Trump sounds when he gets a safe distance from Putin. Everyone saw it was a different story when they were side by side. And that is why I want to hold this up. Today's New York Times features something you don't usually see right here on the front page, a headline exploring a mainstream and now national debate about whether the President of the United States is committing treason. It is common to claim that nothing matters, it feels like to some people in the Trump era. Facts do matter. It was facts and criticism and pushback that exposed Trump's border policy and made him partly cave on it. And now it's facts, this public spectacle of Trump siding with Putin as the Russian leader stood by and walked him out there and watched. Those are facts Americans saw and which have already led Trump to at least spin and try to revise his position, however partially, however ridiculously. Tonight, it is facts that are also driving some to raise this question on the front page of the Times of a president's alleged disloyalty to his own nation, and that has some legislators saying they want this interpreter to testify before Congress to find out what really happened in this private meeting with Putin. Those meetings are usually reserved to the utmost secrecy between leaders. In a moment, the senator leading the push to question the U.S. interpreter on that meeting will join us right here live on The Beat, which should be quite interesting. But we begin with the Washington Post's George Will, one of those conservative critics. His new column says Donald Trump is a, quote, child president, kind of like a baby, with a, quote, play date with a KGB alumnus. And Michelle Goldberg, a columnist for the New York Times, who writes in her own paper that Trump has a slavish and toadying performance towards Trump this week. We're also joined by a special guest and friend of The Beat, Tony Schwartz, who's CEO of the Energy Project and co-authored The Art of the Deal. Mr. Will, I begin with you because as a longtime reader of yours, you are not known for being reflexively or automatically hypercritical of Republican presidents on foreign policy, although you've made your criticisms before. I think this is the first time you've used this language about a president in the relationship with Russia. What moved you to do that? What concerns you about what appears to be an unfolding Trump-made crisis in the U.S. relationship with Russia this week, sir?
Well, you're quite right that this is Trump-made. The president is, and I want to say this as delicately as possible, syntactically challenged. He has a very difficult time getting from subject, object, predicate through a sentence. The sentences tend to explode in mid-flight. And for that reason, it sometimes is difficult to know what he intended to say. Now, I think as a matter of philosophy, if you can't say something, you can't think it. And the fact that a lot of what he says comes out in confused language indicates that there's confusion straight through. That said, it was quite clear, A, what he said in Helsinki, which is that he did not side with the U.S. intelligence agencies, and B, that someone, and I would love to have an analysis of what happened in the White House to bring this about, someone made him sit down and read a statement. He doesn't like to read. He doesn't like to read statements. But to actually go through with this kind of contrition theater after that. But then, as soon as he was done with the contrition, he began to say, well, there are a lot of other people out there. Again, a kind of verbal gas that just put more fog back in place.
So a follow-up. When you say, sir, contrition theater, your emphasis is on the notion that this was not authentic.
Of course. I mean, this is, I don't know if it's the case, as has been reported, that some senior White House people, including perhaps the chief of staff, were orchestrating pushback from the Hill in order to get the president to do this. It would have been quicker just to go in one-stop shopping to Fox News and get someone there to disapprove of it. But clearly, the president was either startled or his staff was startled by this pushback, and clearly someone in the administration said, you better do this or there'll be trouble in-house.
In-house, right, and the notion that it could get even worse than what was widespread public opprobrium. Tony, George says the president doesn't like to read. He also not known for writing, although you were a part of ghostwriting a bestseller of his. You've been ringing an alarm bell very vociferously this week, and part of it is about what is motivating Donald Trump to act this way. And here we have a spectacle of Christopher Wallace, who I should mention happens to be on a competitor channel, although he definitely contributed, I think, to public information with his interview of Vladimir Putin and some of what we learned from it. Here was some of the exchange with Putin, Tony, as Chris Wallace, who again is at Fox, raising profound questions about what motivates Trump to act this way this week.
There are many theories in the United States about why President Trump is so reluctant to criticize you, and I'd like to ask you about a couple of them. One is that you have something on him. Compromise.
We don't have anything on them, and there can't be anything on them. I don't want to insult President Trump when I say this, and I may come as rude, but before he announced that he will run for presidency, he was of no interest for us. Tony?
Well, I'm willing to believe that he was of no interest until he ran for president. That makes sense. On the other hand, what Putin does is exactly what Trump does, or what Trump does is what Putin does, which is they lie for a living. So it's as irrelevant what Putin said in that moment as it is when Trump says what he says. Here's the irony about Donald Trump. It's very unusual that you have a person who, when he is impulsive and speaking reactively, he tends to tell the truth. It's a grim truth that he tells because it reflects what he actually believes. And when he is, quote, reflective, or when he takes time to think about what he's going to say, he always lies.
Let that sink in. Michelle, I want to ask you something, but Senator Shaheen's office has told us to get her on, we have to go to her first. Okay. So that's transparently the situation. So the whole panel stays with me. Let me give a little context to what is about to be, we hope, a newsworthy interview. There is a push to find out what Trump and Putin talked about in their summit meeting that was in private. Trump's translator debriefed by U.S. officials, but experts say the Russians have their own information.
I think whatever Mr. Trump said in that meeting with Mr. Putin is now memorialized on Russian tape, and it will be used as necessary by Mr. Putin against Mr. Trump.
The Kremlin even claims there was a deal that came out of the meeting, bragging about, quote, agreements in the sphere of international security. Now, no U.S. officials are joining up in that kind of statement. Lawmakers want to hear from this Trump translator.
It's important for us to know what was said in the meeting. The interpreter is the one in the room who may have some of that information.
We want the interpreter to come before the committee. We want to see the notes.
All of us want to know what took place in that meeting. I'm not sure it's appropriate to subpoena the translation notes, but if it is, we'll certainly look at it.
I'm joined by the senator you just saw there in that clip, Jeanne Shaheen, who is leading the push to find out what happened behind those closed doors. Thank you for making time. I realize you have a very busy schedule we've been working with. Nice to have you. Why should this type of information go to the Congress and potentially become public?
Congress has an oversight responsibility for our foreign policy. We are an independent branch of government. If we can't get the information to do our jobs, then the American people are the ones who are hurt. So it's very clear that we're not getting a readout from the administration about what happened in that meeting. The interpreter is the only one, as far as I know, who knows what actually happened. And it's not acceptable to have the Russian government tell us what happened in that meeting. It's the defense ministry in Russia that's put out a statement about what was agreed to in that meeting. It's just not acceptable for Congress to take that as what happened in the meeting.
Did you ever make this kind of request of an interpreter working for a previous administration, say the Obama or Bush administration?
No, but we've also never had this kind of an unprecedented meeting where the President of the United States stood up and took the side of our aggressor, the Russian government, against the American people and our own intelligence agencies.
Do you see this then as an exception or a potentially new rule? Because, Senator, as you know, there may be many viewers who hear what you're saying, that this seemed really bad, and thus is a reason to do something. But what if then all private meetings between heads of state are going to have this kind of potential leaking? Wouldn't that be bad for U.S. diplomacy?
Look, I can't address all those other meetings that may happen at some point between presidents and heads of state. What I'm telling folks now and what I believe now is that Congress needs to understand what happened at that meeting. We saw, as I said, an unprecedented performance by an American president undercutting United States interests, taking the side of Russia, which is not a competitor, as it was described by President Trump, but is an aggressor nation. We've seen what happened in Ukraine. We've seen their meddling in our elections in 2016. We've heard from Dan Coats, the president's own DNI, that they're doing it again in advance of the 2018 midterm elections. And yet the president, in the face of all of that evidence, took the side of Vladimir Putin. That is just not acceptable.
And the final question for you, broadening out to, I think, what you just raised, and we've been reporting, and I think viewers have heard a lot about the theories, the mainlining of the questions, what the New York Times today was looking at as the treason question. Do you have any reason to believe, or are you concerned that the reason that Donald Trump did, as you say tonight, undercut U.S. interests in this meeting is somehow illicit, is for some nefarious reason?
I have no idea why he did it. But the point is, Congress needs to fulfill our responsibilities of oversight of our foreign policy and as a separate independent branch of government. And to do that, we need information.
Senator Shaheen joining us between other activities on the Hill. Thank you for telling us about your effort tonight. Much appreciated. I bring back the panel. Michelle, your thoughts.
I mean, my thoughts are that Congress was really remiss in letting this meeting go forward in the first place, although obviously their power over Trump is limited. But there should have been a huge hue and cry over the fact that the president was going into this meeting by himself, something that no previous president would have done, and that basically the American people, it was known going into it that we were going to have to take either Trump or Putin's word for what was said.
And why reward him with a meeting after these indictments?
Well, and not just that, but also, even if you assumed, as I don't assume, that Trump doesn't have sinister motives, he's now in a position where Putin can say that Trump agreed to anything he wants, and Trump has kind of no way to argue otherwise. I mean, it was just so strategically idiotic if you assume that Trump in any way has interests that are contrary to Putin's, which is, not necessarily an obvious assumption.
Yeah. George, I want to read to you from your column. This is the part of the newscast where we go into this sort of Baroque fugue state and think about the difficult questions, and you lay them out disturbingly. You write, Jim Mattis, John Kelly, Daniel Coates, and others might believe they must stay in their positions lest there be no adult supervision of the Oval playpen. This is a serious worry, but so is this. Can those people do their jobs for someone who has neither respect nor loyalty for them? George?
Well, these gentlemen are serious people, and they are vastly experienced, and they have a very difficult decision to make, and I think either way they decide it deserves respect. It is, to say no more, interesting that the president wanted neither his National Security Advisor Bolton nor his Secretary of State Pompeo in the room with him when he was with Mr. Putin. It is not within the power of Congress to prevent this summit in Helsinki. The president's powers in conducting foreign policy are almost plenary, but Congress could, of course, have raised a hullabaloo about going forward with it, and perhaps should have done. And it strikes me as that they're going to have to think long and hard whether that they really want to subpoena this interpreter who was in the room. Woodrow Wilson famously, as part of his 14 points to remake the world, wanted open covenants openly arrived at. There has to be a certain degree of privacy and secrecy in the conduct of diplomacy. So whether Congress really wants to set foot into this dark and bloody ground of controversy, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. That's why I was raising the question for the senator, because one can see the overwhelming interest in this meeting, and yet we all know how precedent works, Tony. If you go down that road, then you don't necessarily have a limiting principle. What are your thoughts on the larger, difficult questions that are facing the nation? What to do about this? What happens in a situation where you still have a constitutionally elected individual here and no way to address what many people, including, according to reports, people inside Trump's own administration viewed as a cataclysmic, disloyal failure of foreign policy this week?
Well, we're dealing with an exceptional case, obviously a unique case with Trump, and in any other situation, you would imagine that the person would be immediately either impeached or in one way or another forced to resign for saying the kinds of disloyal things he did and for arguably being a traitor. What I think is that the Republicans at this point are quite clearly not going to respond to anything, that Trump can shoot someone in the middle of the street, which is the equivalent of what he did. And nobody will respond. Nobody who supports him will respond. So I think actually what you have is an extraordinary issue now for the Democrats going forward, which is, and I can see the ads as we go forward. Do you want Vladimir Putin as your president, or do you want a Democrat and democracy? And I would imagine that that's going to be a very, very powerful argument to make. There's always going to be the 20 or 30% that are going to stay with him no matter what. But I have to say, the number of people who don't want Putin to be in charge of our country or don't want Trump to be a Putin in charge of our country vastly exceeds the number who don't. And so the only question really is, will they get out and vote?
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.